Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of our Expert Insight video series. I am Woodrow Bellamy, Senior Editor with SAE Media Group. In this edition of Expert Insight, we'll be talking about what the aerospace industry can learn from the automotive industry. Joining me for this edition of Expert Insight is a great source of information on this topic. Darren Lazar is the Senior Director of Business Development for ACS. Based in Verona, Wisconsin, ACS is a systems integrator that designs and builds innovative equipment, machines, controls, and facilities across several markets, including automotive vehicles, aerospace, defense, and energy, among others. Since 2017, Darren has been an integral part of ACS, driving business development initiatives. His primary goal is broadening application horizons in the aerospace domain. So Darren, let's start off this conversation by just talking about some of the similarities between these two markets. What are some of the major similarities shared between the automotive and aerospace markets that engineers in each industry may not be aware of?
Currently, the one that I see that's most visible is there's a parallel path to electrification. We have at the same time an automotive industry moving to electrification, as well as the aerospace industry in different segments. And the only difference is the automotive industry is pushing that lever forward in a period of about 10 years. And the aerospace industry is taking a little bit more time towards a goal of 2050. So you've got both those parallels, and the approach is very similar in both industries. And then you also have the parallel along the baseline of alternative fuels. While there's a lot of push going on in both industries for reduced emissions as they relate to electrification, we're also doing parallel paths to alternative fuels, standard fuels that can work with existing technologies or slight changes in approach so that we can adapt them quicker. And hopefully approach some of the same emissions targets that we're doing within the electrification. So those parallels are really dynamic, and right now it's probably the most exciting time to be an engineer in either market because of the rate of change. We're changing 120-year-old technology, if not more, in 10 and 20 years. So that drives a lot of change and challenges in both industries.
Yeah, it certainly is a really exciting time, especially with things like eVTOLs coming up. What can aerospace industry or aerospace engineers learn from the automotive industry and how it manages performance assessments of aging test facilities and equipment?
There's a lot of work here to do, and there's some stark differences, right? So in automotive, they have to design very flexible facilities from the start because their life cycle is much, much different. And they don't move to a new building every time they produce a new variant to the vehicle. So aerospace, their volume is different. So what they need to look at more is updates over time to requirements to stay current. What is the future proofing of that facility require, right? And then we employ an approach that helps a lot in automotive, and it's what we call an FEP, or a front-end plan. And we work with our clients to understand what their goals and objectives are in both their building and their equipment. And when we understand both of those, then we look at the building requirements from the inside out, understanding our equipment and what that building needs to deliver in order for both to be effective. So it's a process that we've developed over our 26 plus years of experience, and we bring it to bear, and it really reduces the timeline and the cost estimations. It gives you a much better target of where your funds need to be directed.
And let's talk a little bit about data acquisition. What can aerospace companies learn from the automotive sector's approach to data acquisition for test facilities and equipment?
So there's been a lot of changes here over time as well. Within automotive, there's a strong approach to looking at off-the-shelf data acquisition hardware and open architecture software solutions. Within aerospace, that has not been the case. There is traditionally a lot of proprietary equipment that drives a lot of cost. So automotive is constantly looking for ways to take those technologies and open up those architectures. And that's the basis that we develop off of. So we deploy open architecture, off-the-shelf solutions. And while there was a time when it was necessary to have all that proprietary architectures, it's for the most part gone. We can do it with off-the-shelf technologies. The other thing that's being integrated more is health monitoring in both the terms of the equipment and the building. So if you can monitor both, report on them consistently with historical data, then you can make sure that both are effective and both are ready to execute when they're needed, instead of being integrated or started into a test and find that you have an inability to maybe deliver the HVAC that the test equipment needs to operate. So monitoring that information, reporting on it in real time, is we see a lot more of that taking place. And then the other aspect that we see, and it's really being addressed as they're migrating newer facilities and newer data, is how they migrate that old data to new. And then they're establishing, and I don't mean changing the data, but establishing common naming platforms so that they can integrate all the old data into the new and have much more of a historical view, as opposed to having to go in and figure out all those label changes that took place from cell to cell. So what I mean there is maybe you have an analog output labeled fuel 1, and in every one of your test cells, it has a different name. So when that happens, it's tough to align your data. So those kind of consistency things and processes can actually be learned both ways, but it's automotive drives it more because their need to change over is more frequent.
And when you look at data acquisitions, are there any new technologies that have been embraced by the automotive sector that the aerospace industry can adopt?
There is less about new technologies, although they're out there in terms of performance speed, data acquisition rates, and capabilities. It's more about how they're being applied in those industries. And some of the newer things that are out there is more in the communication rates to ensure that we're able to do deterministic real-time control, and those rates are really being increased. And then the other thing that's really happening is how it's being applied. So more distributed I/O, and that really approaches challenges for aerospace, because in some of the tests in aerospace, the scale and the number of channels is just that much more. So distributing that I/O is very important and can reduce costs.
And since we're talking about what the aerospace industry can learn from the automotive sector, can you talk about what are some of the factors that challenge the aerospace industry's ability to update its approach to data acquisition in the way that the automotive sector has?
Some of the big ones are life cycle. The life cycle of an aircraft is significantly longer than the life cycle of an automobile. So, for example, the current 737, not in its current rendition, but that whole airframe is roughly 57 years old. You wouldn't imagine that in automotive. So they have challenges whereby funding is typically tied to a program as opposed to tied to R&D. And then they have even a bigger challenge, and that's dealing with obsolescence. And that impacts tremendously. And for example, you may have a test system that's required to be operational for 25 years. Well, as components change, it's very difficult for the supplier of the component or the subsystem to update it. They have to align all that data, make sure it is comparable. They have to get authorization from the airframer. That is all very expensive, and everybody's resistant because the data has been proven. Now you have to do correlation, and it's large costs. So that is a huge challenge in aerospace that isn't necessarily in automotive.
And you mentioned electrification earlier. We're starting to see a lot more aerospace companies investing in the electrification of aircraft. And considering electric vehicles are already sort of a reality on the ground, what can the aerospace industry learn from the automotive sector's introduction of new research and development facilities to develop new aircraft batteries and technologies?
Yeah, so this is as much parallel, and I think the learning can go both ways. Because while these industries are more advanced in automotive, they're still in their early stages as well. So this is where it's much more parallel, and the learning is going to be much more dynamic because they can happen at the same time. And that's really important for both industries to know. The other challenge is in the aircraft industry, when you start moving more people, the scale isn't the same. So you're going to be looking at different technologies for how many people you're going to travel in an aircraft. And the larger scale won't be the same battery electric that we're seeing in automotive. So there's going to be changes there in different requirements. But the biggest thing that aerospace can learn from automotive is in regulation and safety. Safety really is going to be identical in both, no matter whether it's the current state of electrification or how they both advance. Both are invested in hydrogen, both are invested in alternate fuels. They all carry risk with how they work. And there is not a lot of regulation that covers those specifics in detail. So understanding that and taking industry best practices is critical. And we're doing that today for both customers in both industries.
Yeah, it certainly will be exciting to continue to watch the aerospace industry's kind of adoption of electrification and to see that become more of a reality. So, Darren, I want to say thanks for joining us and sharing some insights on this very interesting topic. For any of the viewers who want more information about this topic, go to the ACS website and download their white paper titled Aerospace: What the Industry Can Learn from the Automotive Sector. That brings us to the end of this edition of Expert Insight. Thanks for joining us.